Hey guys, welcome back to our podcast. Hope you are doing great today. In today's episode, we will be answering some of your questions and about major economists and philosophers of the 18th and 19th century. First of all, I have three questions of Adam Smith. First of all, who's Smith? Well, Adam Smith was an economist and a philosopher, Scottish. Considered the father of the economy, is one of the greatest bases of modern economy. Second one, what's one of its greatest books? That will be The Walls of the Nations, written by Adam Smith. Um, it talked about a lot of themes, many themes. And while some generals, such as quality over quantity, which is putting an example of multiple men with little skill making only 100 copies of a product per day, and a young man with the necessary skill making 3,000 copies of the product, it has a main problem that is related with the third question. It says, what's the connection with other philosophers? Well, the Wealth of the Nations is in fact a continuation of the philosophical theme started in the theory of moral sentiments. The problems Mill addresses is how internal struggle between passions and unbiased viewer exerts its effects on the larger arena of history itself, both long and short term. Now my partner, Eugenio Loesa, will ask the question about Hegel.
Now, the question that I received was who was Hegel? Well, Hegel was a German philosopher and the most important figure in German idealism. The German philosopher who developed a dialectical scheme that emphasized the progress of history and of ideas from thesis to antithesis and thence to a synthesis. The Hegelian dialectic consists in establishing a thesis, its opposite, an antithesis, and its resolution in a synthesis. Each affirmation of something corresponds to its respective negations, and to the clash between the two, a solution or conclusion that later becomes another thesis, and so on. His dialectic is not a simple method of thought to interpret reality, but rather it constitutes the principle of the constructive movement of the spirit, of nature, and of all human history and culture. The dialectic made by Hegel was used by Marx, and you will know it in continue with my partners Valeria Diaz and Fernando Bravo.
One of our listeners also asked, who was Karl Marx? Well, Karl Marx was a German philosopher, economist, and political revolutionary born in 1818. His two major works are the Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, which he wrote with Friedrich Engels. He is known for advocating for communism and his theories of capitalism. His ideas are the basis of Marxism and communism. Marx's ideas had a huge impact on societies, most prominently in communist projects such as those in USSR, China, and Cuba. In 1864, he helped to found the International Workingmen's Association and wrote its inaugural address. He also asked, what did he talk about in the Das Kapital? The first volume of Das Kapital was published in 1867. The third and second volume were edited and published by Friedrich Engels a couple years after Marx passed away. In Capital, Marx explained his theory of capitalism and addresses the nature of commodities, division of labor, wages, association, and wrote its inaugural address. He also asked, what did he talk about in the Das Kapital? The first volume of Das Kapital was published in 1867. The third and second volume were edited and published by Friedrich Engels a couple years after Marx passed away. In Capital, Marx explained his theory of capitalism and addresses the nature of commodities, division of labor, wages, and the worker-capitalist relationship where the owners are the capitalists and exploit their workers. Therefore, capitalism has inevitable tendencies toward self-destruction. In chapter 1 and 2, he defines a commodity as an external object that satisfies human needs of whatever kind, and there are three ways to measure the value of a commodity: use value, exchange value, and value. By use value, he refers to a commodity quality and usefulness. Exchange value is a certain amount of something that can be exchanged for a certain amount of something else. These two commodities must have a common element to be exchanged, which is the object's value, meaning the amount of labor socially necessary to produce it. He also introduces the concept of private property by reminding us that commodities cannot take themselves to the market. Hence, they need a human to take ownership so they can relate to other commodities. Marx adds that these commodities don't represent a value of use to their garden, and instead they are only the incarnation of the exchange value. Later on, Marx explains that money can take many forms, and that takes on two values: its original use value as a commodity and universal use value, which arises from a specific social function. Now, my collaborator Fernando will explain his relation with Engels.
Well, I have received some questions. One was, what was the relationship between Marx and Engels? Well, Karl Marx and Engels were partners in the Socialist Political Party and had a close intellectual and political collaboration. Both developed the books named The Manifesto and Das Kapital, or most commonly, The Capital. Well, these books are considered as one of the most books important in the history of economy. I have another question, and is how do Marx and Engels know each other? Well, these two philosophers know in a visit to Paris, where they develop the social party, and in this moment, they create the books. After that, Marx had a connection with Hegel when he wrote a criticism of some paragraphs of the foundations of the philosophy of law, especially those referring to the state, which is why the text is known as Hegel's Critique of State Philosophy, a text published by the Soviet Marxologist David Razanov in 1927. Well, to make a conclusion of this episode, we have the relation of all these philosophers, and it is Marx had many influences of Adam Smith, and he addresses some of his theories and compares them to his. Also, Marx, during many time, studied Adam Smith and used Hegel dialectics. With that resources make the manifesto by using Adam Smith's work as the thesis, his work and ideas as the antithesis, and the manifesto as the resolution of Engels continue that work. Well, thank you for listening this podcast, and we will see you in the next episode.